Alright, for this video we're going to get into how the EU is governed. Just a quick overview, just sort of grouping them by category. Kind of the supreme political body, kind of the driving force of the EU government is the European Council. We have three different lawmaking bodies. Each of them have, actually, two of them have overlapping roles. Two of them vote, and then one of them drafts legislation. And then we also have a justice body. It's not a lawmaking body, but it enforces and polices the laws and can punish a state that does not follow them. Okay, so just an overview, and also this is a really helpful flowchart that you can see over here to the right if you're more of a visual learner to understand the EU's legislative process. So I was sort of providing metaphors when we were talking about these different institutions in class, and I want to stick with those metaphors now. So think about the European Council as the institution that's behind the driver's seat, right? It just decides the direction of the EU, right? It sets its agenda. It prioritizes what should be negotiated for legislation above all others. Obviously, just like our government works, there are thousands of different ideas that are floated across our government to be potentially drafted into law. You can kind of see the European Council as like a sift to prioritize what should be actually negotiated. Once they prioritize, the next institution that deals with the law is the European Commission, right? Its job is to actually take these ideas and draft them into legislation, right? So in class, I was calling them the architect, right? So they both propose laws. The other power that they have is they can table a law, right? So that means that if something is suggested to them by the European Council, they can say, no, we're not going to draft that into the law, but they do have to provide a reason why. And the other thing that they do is they work with the Council and the Parliament to set the spending priorities of the EU. So they don't actually get to negotiate and plan the budget, but they still are able to sort of provide suggestions as to where the priorities of spending should be. Getting into the lawmaking parties, right? First, you have the European Parliament, right? They work with the EU Council, which we're going to call the Council of Ministers to free ourselves from confusion. So basically, they work with the European Commission's proposals. They also scrutinize, sort of act as a watchdog over other EU institutions. And they also establish and then approve the EU's budget. So again, like we were saying before, the Commission sets priorities for the budget, whereas the European Parliament actually plans the budget, and they also work together with the EU Council to do that. And we generally see the European Parliament as the most democratic of the EU institutions, and that's because they are elected directly by EU citizens. And also, they proportionally are represented. So that means that states, or rather nations with larger populations, have more seats in the European Parliament than the smaller states do. The other actual law making body is the EU Council. We're going to call them the Council of Ministers because these two have such similar names. We don't want to confuse. And it's made up of ministers, right? It actually differs in configuration based on specialty, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a future slide. So again, it worked with the European Parliament to negotiate and adopt laws, and it works, of course, before that with the European Commission's proposals, and also along with the European Parliament, they adopt and write budget policies. Lastly, you have the European Court of Justice. They don't actually make laws, but once they are passed, they interpret them. They make sure that they are applied properly in each member country because, as an integrated political party, each EU member nation is beholden to these laws and enforces the laws. So, any EU nation that does not comply, it ultimately can punish it, most likely some sort of financial punishment. And they can also evaluate laws. So if they believe that any EU law violates a pre-existing treaty, they can annul it, which means that they can declare it null and void. So for metaphor's sake, I like to think of the European Court of Justice as the enforcer and policer of the laws. Check out this flowchart if you're more of a visual learner. That should help you, and you could kind of follow along by looking at this list and seeing how this works. All right, so just zeroing a little bit more on each institution, we see a photo of, this is actually the 2016 European Council, so it has changed slightly, but you can't make out a lot of these faces. They're a little bit blurry, but I do spy Angela Merkel here in the background, right? So every country in Europe has some sort of different head of state. They vary in title. We have prime ministers. We have chancellors, for example, we have presidents. They are the seat in the European Council. So, as you can surmise, most of these heads of state are sort of like the eyes and ears of their people, right? In general, they're very clued into the priorities of their country, and so that's why they are the agenda setter of the European Union government, right? Currently, the president of the European Council is Donald Tusk. The EU Commission, again, like we are saying, the architect of the European Union government. Um, they propose laws. They also uh, are made up of a college of commissioners. There's 28 different members of the EU Commission, one for each state. And again, their job is to propose legislation, right, to draft legislation. They manage the budget, but they do not actually write it. They do work with the Court of Justice to also enforce laws, and also they are a representation of the EU worldwide. The European Parliament, again, like we were saying before, it's kind of seen as the most democratic because it is directly elected by citizens. It also is the largest institution of the EU. It has 751 MEPs. MEP stands for Member of Parliament. They're elected every 5 years. And as you can see by this chart over here, the larger the state is in population, the more members of parliament it has. So you can see a state like Germany has 96, whereas a small state like Malta has 6, and actually 6 is the minimum number of seats you can have in the European Parliament, which does allow them to have maybe proportionally a little bit more of a voice than they would otherwise. The three main powers, right? The most important, the power to legislate, right? The power to actually negotiate and pass the laws that are drafted by the European Commission. They also have supervisory powers, right? They can scrutinize other institutions in the EU government. And then lastly, also very important, that they have power of the purse, right? They actually create the budget of the EU. And the way in which they sit is by party. So they're not actually meeting based on their state. There are people from all different EU nations representing each of these pieces of the pie. Okay, the EU Council. Again, we're going to call that the Council of Ministers just to make it easier, right? They, along with the Parliament, also, their job is to pass laws, to negotiate with the European Parliament. They have 28 members, so that makes them smaller than the European Parliament. We could kind of see them like the Senate in a way, although they're not exactly the same, but they are like the Senate in terms of the type of representation they have. It's equal representation. No matter how big the country, you have the same number of ministers, right? So Germany has one, Malta has one. Um, the other thing that makes them unique is that the ministers change. There are several different configurations that you can see over here. So, depending on the nature of the law that's up for negotiation, different ministers that specialize in that field actually come to the negotiating table, right? So, if you have an environmental issue that's on the docket for legislation, the environmental minister attends those meetings. So I guess you could say that the parliament is not only democratic, rather, or more democratic. It also is a little bit more general of a voice in terms of the lawmaking powers. Not every parliament member is a specialist in each issue, whereas the European, or rather the EU Council, the Council of Ministers, specializes more on given issues. Again, here are their 5 roles, right? And then lastly, this is a really good thing to check out. This is not YouTube, so you have to actually click on this video link and scroll down to the bottom of the page and you'll see it. But this is the EU's video that's explaining the difference between the European Council and the EU Council, so it's worth checking that out. And then lastly, you have the European Court of Justice, right? They do not make laws, but they deal with laws once they are already passed. Their job is to provide legal judgments on cases brought before it, right? Again, they can determine if a state is not properly following the EU law consistently across the board, and they can punish a state if that happens. It is also equally represented. There is one judge from each EU country. Um, and its real job is just to make sure, yeah, that every state is applying the law in the exact same way. And they can also decide if a law is to be annulled if it is violating some pre-existing EU treaty. All right, one last video. I know I've included a lot of these embedded videos, but that's for a reason. I think they're all really good at providing visuals and providing just another way of hearing these processes. So definitely check this one out right after you finish this video, which is now, because we're going to stop here and we're going to have a new video next on EU enlargement. So stay tuned for that, and thanks.